But Pines was not an identity, it was a place. So I would say I'm a person of native descent from the Pines. That would have been my answer. But since the culture is more protected in the Pines these days, where the outside changed, but the Piney culture stayed sort of like a default position. I'm a Piney because that is the only protection for um, that identity. Now, my father, when he took me out, like he took me into where like women would play the saw with the bow and all those different music in different places in the Pines. When I got a little older, he took me to those places. He wouldn't have said it was the Piney culture, even though that's what he was teaching me. He would call it the old-timey culture. And that's how I grew up to think of it, the old-timey culture. And it used to be more widespread outside the Pines, okay? I'll give you an example. The Mummers. You see the Mummers Parade? That started by mixed native and Swedish people who lived along the river. And on New Year's they would go out and would shoot guns and stuff. They would call it the shooters, okay? And so they lived in Indian type houses, and they lived separate like the Pineys did. And that grew into, like, by the time of the Revolutionary War, they became the rebels, and they started rebelling, and it became bigger than just the Swedish Indian mixtures. They all identified that because in Europe they had secret societies, right? And it was like the Knights of St. Andrew and the Knights of St. George and things like that. So in an act of rebellion, they picked for their saint an Indian chief leader, Chief Tammany. So it became the Knights of St. Tammany, and they rebelled against the war. Now, like, you've heard of the Boston Tea Party, correct?
Yes.
And they dressed. They didn't dress because nobody was going to be fooled of them dressed as Indian. They know that they weren't Indians. They weren't Mohawk Indians. That just told people who knew what secret society they belonged to, and that's where they did. And eventually became, the Tammany Hall became the Democratic seat, and it moved to New York, and it moved away from its original roots.
Ooh.
But its original roots was those type of people, the mixed native and all that. So the Pineys are still there. The other ones are disappearing, and they also went along the creeks and all. Like if you go up to Masonville, where Harry is from, they have people who were Piney descent. They live along a creek, and the outside people call them Creek Angels. They're not called Pineys, but they're Creek Angels. The same people. It's the same family: Skybersons, Fords, Fenimores. The same families, and they're related to the Pineys, but they moved out along the creeks too, further out. And then, of course, you know that when they wrote that thing about they wanted to sterilize the Pineys and that period, they didn't sterilize them, but they went in and they took people out. And mostly they took out people with black blood and native blood. And they were placed in 4 towns along the river. Now, I'm not going to tell you the other 3 because those communities are still there and they want to keep secret. But the one I'll talk about, Riverside, when we talk, and how that developed, and those families. So they were there. Plus, when Zuberg built his watch case, they wouldn't let him build it in Mount Holly. So he built it in Riverside, which was more or less a stage stop. He built the town, and he brought Pineys out in the town. So Riverside is like a Piney town in exile. Okay, and there's
Your family came for that, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, well, my grandfather was born in Stafford Porch, if you know where Stafford is. And he came from a real Piney traveling family. because each son, like my grandfather was born in Stafford, but another son was born in Red Bank, and another one was born in Bulltown. So he was traveling where the work was, and the kids were born in different towns. So, but we say my grandfather came from Stafford because that's where he was born and that's where he came. And then he moved to Mount Holly to work. And then eventually, when my father was born, about 12, they moved to Riverside for work. They worked in the watch case and those places. So that's how we became that. Now, if you ask any of those people from those 4 towns if they are Pineys, they would say no. They would consider themselves people of native descent, and that's how I originally saw myself. A person of native descent from the Pines. But I think we have to become Pineys to survive. Now that's our protection, to not be assimilated and become part of the regular society. I always bring in all my little artwork and stuff.
This is beautiful. But Harry, listen.